What's up guys, it's Brad from LightArchitect here. In this video I'm going to be showing how you can add some heat, distortion, and sparks to your scene to enhance any fire that you might have within it. This technique is super simple but can add just that extra touch of detail to provide a little bit more realism or a more unique, interesting looking result. Before we get started, I would like to announce that we are having a 30% off sale on our Spotify Void System add-on for Blender for the next 10 days of August. So if you're interested in this add-on or if you may find it useful, just use the discount code August30 for that 30% off at Blender Market checkout. Anyways guys, let's get started. Here we are inside of Blender. The first thing we'll do is of course delete everything in our scene here. Now I will go to our plus tab here and we'll go to visual effects and then motion tracking. And the first thing we're going to do is import our live action footage that we're going to add our heat, displacement, and sparks to. However, if you have a 3D scene where you have some fire in it, this technique can apply as well. But we're going to be adding our heat, distortion, and sparks to a live action shot. So we need to motion track it first. So I'm just going to click on the open button here and go to our movie clip that we're going to add our visual effects to. And I just have this MP4 file here, but feel free to use an image sequence if you want a little bit better workflow. As I mentioned before, I've never had any issues with using an MP4 file. And I'll click on open. And this is the clip we're going to be adding our heat distortion to. I'll go ahead and click on prefetch to load all of the frames in Blender so we don't have to load those every time. And then I'll also click on the set scene frames so that Blender automatically sets the timeline to the length of our movie clip here. And we can adjust this later if we don't want to render out all those frames, but this is just a nice way to get started and get an idea of what our movie clip is looking like. And this is our clip here. As you can see, it's a shot of a burning house and not a lot of 3D camera movement in this shot. It's pretty much just a pan from left to right, so it's going to be a pretty simple track, but we're just going to add some sparks and heat distortion to the most fiery parts of our footage here to give it a little bit more interesting look. Alright, so let's go ahead and detect some features for Blender to track. As I mentioned before, if you have a very complex shot that you want to use this technique in or add some 3D elements to, I do have a more advanced 3D camera tracking tutorial on this channel here. So I'll put a link to that in the description if your shot is a little bit more complicated or if you want to learn 3D camera tracking in a little bit more detail. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm just going to use a very basic tripod track. So I'll just go to the beginning of our shot here, and I'm actually going to end our shot around frame 500 just because I think it's going to be a little bit long to go all the way to 600. So I'll just change this to 500 real quick. And now I'll just go to the beginning of our shot. I will change our tracking settings here to blurry footage just so our tracking markers are a little bit bigger. And then I will click on detect features, and Blender is going to choose a variety of points here for us, but I'm going to open this little thumbnail box here and decrease the threshold down to 0 so that there are a lot more points in our scene. And we actually don't need this many points in our shot, but it doesn't hurt to have a little extra tracking data as long as your tracking error is pretty low. Generally I shoot for below 1, but below 2 is sometimes okay as well, depending on the detail your shot requires. As long as you have good solve error, you should be fine. So I'll just select all of our features here and I'll click on track forward, and Blender is going to track all these points forward throughout our shot here. And then I'll go to the end of our timeline. I'll click on detect features again and we'll track these features backwards. And I'm not too worried about the points sliding off of their tracking markers yet because we're going to clean up our track and get rid of those. I'm just trying to get as much data as possible here as long as our computer doesn't start slowing down. I'll go to the middle of our timeline, click on detect features again, track these forward, and then I will track them backwards as well. And I'll just go to different points of our timeline and keep on repeating this process until we have data throughout our entire shot so that Blender can recreate our camera move. Alright, so I'll just select all of our tracking points here and scroll through our shot. And as you can see, we have more than enough tracking data to work with. We do need to clean this up a bit. As you can see, some of the points are on our fire here, which is moving, which we don't actually want to use as data for our camera move. But what I'm going to do is I'm just going to clean that up once we solve it the first time. So I'll go ahead and go to our top right 3D window here. I'll press Shift A. I'll add a camera to our scene so we can add our tracking data to this camera. And then I will go to solve, make sure all of our tracking markers are selected here. I'll select the tripod option since this shot was filmed on a tripod, as you can see from the footage itself. I will click on refine focal length, and now I will click on solve camera motion, and let's see what solve error Blender gives us. Alright, so Blender has given us a solve error of 35.09 pixels, which is not good at all. We want to try to get this below at least 2, even lower if your shot is more complicated and you need a little bit more detail in your elements. We're going to clean up this track, and as you can see here in our bottom graph preview, this is a good indicator that a lot of your tracking markers are off, as if they are together, all of these lines will be fairly consistent, and you can see all these spikes off of our graph here. So we don't actually want that. I'll go to our cleanup tab on the left side here. We want to deselect all of our tracking markers really quick, and I'll click on clean tracks and then increase the reprojection error to maybe 14. And what this is doing is it's selecting any of our tracking markers that have a reprojection error of 14 or above. The higher you set this, the less points that will be selected, and the points will have more errors. So we just want to select the points in our shot that have the most error in them, and then we'll just delete them here. So I'll set this at 19 for now, and I'll click on X and delete the tracks here. And we still should have enough data to work with since it's a very simple track. And as you can see here, our graph is looking much cleaner at the bottom. Still have a few spikes here. I might select a few of these points off of our graph here and just delete them manually, just because I'm fairly certain that they're not what we want. Alright, so this should be pretty good. There are a few points spiking off here, but there should be enough data to reconstruct the scene, I think. So I'm going to select all of our points once more and click on Solve Camera Motion. And we have a solve error of 4.89 pixels, which is, again, not perfect, but much lower than our initial track. So now I will click on Clean Tracks again, and we'll select some points with a reprojection error of 9 or above maybe, and delete these. Select all of our points again, and click on Solve Camera Motion, and let's see if we get any lower. And 3.18 pixels. I think that should be pretty good since we're adding moving elements. Our heat distortion and sparks can have a little bit of random movement, so as long as our camera isn't erratically going off of its track, we should be pretty good here. Feel free to repeat this process if you're going for a little bit more precise look. Try to get it below 1, I would say, but it's pretty much just the same process over and over repeated. So now that we've tracked our camera, I'm going to go to our scene setup panel here in our solve tab. I'll click on set as background. So now, as you can see here, when we go to viewpoint camera in our top right window, we actually have our footage as our background here, which is going to be very helpful in adding our elements. Then I'm also going to add an origin for our camera. So I'll just select a point here that's kind of near the center of our scene here, and go to orientation and set it as our origin. And now, as you can see here, that point is the point of 0, 0, 0 in our scene. So this should be good. Now I'm going to click on Setup Tracking Scene, and Blender will automatically add a foreground and background collection for us. And we're not going to use these exactly how Blender automatically adds them, but it just gives us a good starting point with view layers as well as collections in our scene. So I'll go back to layout mode here and explain this really quick. The foreground collection contains a cube which will be rendered as a normal object in our scene, and the background collection contains a ground plane that is a shadow catcher. And then we have two different view layers here that are added. The foreground is, again, our main cube, and then our background will not render our foreground layer, but will only render it indirectly on our ground as a shadow pass. I'm going to go ahead and delete this background layer, so I'll press X. And now we just have one foreground view layer, which is what we're going to work with. And for this specific tutorial, we're going to be adding some particle systems to use as data for heat distortion, and then a particle system for sparks, as I mentioned. So we don't actually need this information, so I'll go ahead and delete them. I probably didn't even need to set up that tracking scene, but it just helps with the compositing node setup here. It automatically sets up some nodes for us to work with, which I find pretty useful. So I just generally press that setup tracking scene in the motion tracking option. But anyways, to continue, I'll delete our background layer here. And now we just have one foreground view layer. I'll move our camera to our scene collection. I'll open up a new window here, and I'll go to View, Viewpoint, Camera. So now we can see through our camera on this right panel here. And I just want to kind of readjust our camera here in our scene so that it's a little bit nicer to work with. I'll put it off to the side here. The reason it's so long here is because our 3D track refined our focal length, and the live action shot was shot with a very long lens, probably like a 250 millimeter or something. So let's see here. Blender thinks it's a 400 millimeter lens, which might be accurate, I'm not really sure, but for our purposes, it shouldn't matter much. But anyways, let's add some particle systems to use as sparks first. So I'm going to press Shift A. I'll add a very basic icosphere here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to place this by some of our fire in the scene. And if you want, you can select the motion tracking data here. Depending on the result you get, you might get some motion tracking data in your camera here, so it can be a little bit confusing to work with. So I'm just going to kind of eyeball it for this specific tutorial. So I'll take that off. And this icosphere is going to emit the spark particles that we're going to add to our scene when we add a particle system to it. So what I want to do is I just want to find the most fiery parts of our live action shot and add this icosphere in that part of the scene. So I'll just scale it down here, put it maybe by our fiery door here, maybe scale it up on the z-axis. Doesn't have to be perfect since we're not actually going to be rendering the sphere here. We're just going to be rendering the spark particles that are emitted from it. So this should be pretty solid. As you can see here, if I play through the shot, it's just sticking right on our fire here, which is exactly what we want. All right, so now let's add our particle system to emit these spark particles. I'll actually go ahead and relabel our icosphere to spark emitter. So while our icosphere is selected, I'll go to our particle system tab. I'll add a new particle system. We'll use an emitter particle system. And as you can see here, if I play through our shot, this is what we're getting so far, which is not what we want, but we can adjust it a bit. I'll scroll down here to our viewport display. I'll display it as a cross so we can just view it a bit better. Since our particles are going down in our scene, we want to actually turn gravity off. So I'll scroll down here to field weights, and for gravity I'll turn this to 0. And now as you can see here, if we replay through our particle system, we get something like this, which is much better. And as you can see here, our particle system is a bit too big for the sparks in our scene right now. There are a few ways we can deal with this. We can bring this back further into the background of our scene so that it doesn't look quite as big, or we could change the normal value of our velocity of the particle system. You could actually bring this lower so the particles aren't emitted quite as quickly. But I'm just going to bring this further back in our shot. Since our shot is a fairly simple tripod track, this should be enough for us. So I'll just bring our particle system in the back of our scene here, put it right here. And now as you can see here, already looking a little bit better. I think I might just scale it up a bit. I'll also decrease the normal value of these particles to maybe 0.35. Let's try this out. That's actually not a bad option for us here. You can also increase the randomize option so that the velocity is a little bit more random. That's probably a little too much, maybe 0.2. And at this point, it's a matter of adjusting your particle settings so that you get the right looking particle system for your sparks. One thing I might do for this specific example, I might increase the speed of the particles a bit in their normal value. Something like that is not bad. And I might decrease the lifetime. Since our sparks are lasting for 50 frames, that's a little bit too long. That's about 2 seconds. So maybe about 1 second, so maybe 20 frames. Try this out. And that's looking a little bit better for a spark particle system. So I'm going to go with this for now, but feel free to adjust mainly your velocity settings in your particle parameters to get the look you want. One more thing I might do before we duplicate this particle system and place it in other areas of our scene to emit sparks, I might just add a force field to push our particle system a little bit off to the top right here, just because as you can see here when we play through our footage, our fire in the live action shot is actually going off to the top right as well. So what we can do is we can just press Shift A. I'll add a force field, and I'll just do a very standard force field here, and I'll put this right below our spark particle system. Play through it here, see what we're getting. And as you can see, now the particles are kind of being pushed to the top right here, which is a little bit more like our fire. And I'll select our particle system once more. I might decrease their lifetime a bit to 15, since I think the particles are going a little bit too far out here. And then I'll increase their lifetime randomness to 1, and let's see what that gives us. Yeah, I think that's a little bit better. Again, feel free to add your own stylistic choice depending on the look you're going for. All right, so this should be pretty good. Now let's create the actual spark particle that we're going to instance on this spark particle system. For the spark particle, we're just going to use a very basic icosphere that's set as an emission shader, and we're going to make it orange so it's like the color of the fire. So it's a super simple process. What we'll do is we'll just press Shift A. I will add another icosphere here, and I'll just place it off to the side of our scene so we don't actually see it in our shot. And we're going to label this, I'll call it spark particle, and go to our material settings, add a new material, and we'll switch the surface to an emission material and change the color to the color of our fire here. So something red like this. And now as you can see here, if I go to rendered view, we just have this kind of orange particle here. And we're rendering in Eevee right now. We actually want to render this out in cycles. So I'll just go to our render tab here, switch this over to cycles really quick. It might not look too different, but I prefer to use cycles when doing live action. We'll use this for now. Might increase the strength of our emission shader to maybe 2. So it's just a little bit brighter, maybe even 4. But you get the idea. Just a very basic spark. Since it's going to be so small, you don't need to add a lot of detail to it. So we'll just select our particle system once again here in the right panel. And under our particle system settings, I'll scroll down here to render. And instead of rendering it as a halo, I'm going to render it as an object and instance our spark particle. And then also in our viewport display, I'll display as rendered. So now we can see how our spark particles are looking. And as you can see here, it's looking way too big. So what we're going to do is you can either drop down the particle size of your spark particle itself, or you can also select your particle system, go under render and scale it down to maybe 0.01. Still a little bit too big, maybe 0.002. Now they are much smaller and looking more like sparks, which is what we want. And I'll just scroll up here. We want a few more particles in our system here. So I'll increase the particles in the spark emitter to maybe 5,000. And now as you can see here, lots more particles being emitted, which is what we want. Again, feel free to adjust however many you want. I also want to change the end frame of our spark emitter to the end of our timeline. So change this to 500. And probably because of that, we need to emit more sparks. So maybe I'll change our number here to 7,000. All right, so something like that should be pretty good. As you can see, if I go to rendered view, you'll see all of our sparks being emitted here. I'm going to select our spark emitter under our particle settings. I will deselect the show emitter option in our render and also in our viewport display. So now as you can see, only our sparks are being rendered in this view layer. So great, we've added some sparks to our scene. They might be a little bit too big, so I might bring down the scale to 0.0015. And maybe increase the scale randomness to 0.5 to give them a little bit of random size. So this should be pretty good. I'm going to select the show emitter option for our viewport just so we can work a bit better. Now what we're going to do is I'm just going to duplicate this particle system and place it in other areas where the fire is very dense in our scene. So for example, there's a little portion off to the right here when the camera pans to the right. So I'll press Shift D, duplicate this particle system and place it over here wherever we want it. Probably at this most fiery point here. And you can just kind of resize it to get the sparks being emitted where you want them. And because the fire is so bright, they blend into the fire a bit better, which helps us composite everything in our scene. And yeah, this is how you can create your spark systems. Just keep duplicating them and adding these particle systems where you want them in your scene. If you want to make each of these particle systems different, you can duplicate these particle settings so that whenever you adjust one, it doesn't adjust the other two. But for the sake of this tutorial, I'm going to continue on to the heat displacement portion of this video. But this is the general concept here. I'll get into compositing these in a bit, but let's add a new view layer with our heat distortion particle system. All right, so I'll go to our top right here and I'll add a new view layer, and we'll call this one heat distortion. And I also want to rename this foreground layer where we have our spark particles. I'll just call it sparks. So now we have two view layers, and we'll go to heat distortion, and I'll also relabel this collection here to sparks. And now I will select one of our spark emitters. I will press Shift D, duplicate it, scale it up a bit. I will duplicate its particle settings here, and we'll call this distortion. I'll also relabel this object heat distortion, and I'll press M, move it to a new collection, call it heat distortion. Okay. All right, so now we have a new particle system here in its own collection, and what we're going to do is we're going to do the same thing we did for our sparks, but for this particle system, we want the data to be very large so that we can use the white portions of this view layer to actually overlay a displacement map on top of our footage and give it that heat wave look. So you can try this technique with any kind of data you want, but I found that using particle systems allows you to get a really nice effect. So So what I'm going to do is in our particle system settings for our heat distortion particle system, I'm going to change our instance object to another object that we're just going to make white in our scene. So I'll press Shift A, I'll add another icosphere. I will move it next to our spark particle so it's not in our shot. So I'll put them next to each other here. I'll relabel this one distortion particle, and I'll move it to our heat distortion collection. And all this particle is going to be is just a white particle. So we don't even need to add any material to it if we don't want to, because the default diffuse material will work just fine for our heat displacement. And now I'll select our heat distortion particle system once more. I'll go to our render settings and switch our instance object to our distortion particle. And then I also want to increase the scale of this distortion particle so it's much bigger in our scene. So maybe to 0.1. And now as you can see here, we have this particle system that's like our spark emitters. However, it's much more data to work with to use as a displacement map. And the whole point is to just create a particle system that overlays where you want your heat distortion to be and that kind of mimics the movement that you want your heat distortion to be. So this should be just fine here. I might increase the scale randomness a bit so that there's a little bit more randomness. And I also might increase the lifetime of these a bit as well, maybe to 20. So it goes a little bit further off to the right in our scene, and maybe change their normal value a little bit higher as well so it's a little bit faster, maybe 0.8. And let's see what this gets us. That's not bad. It's a little bit too big, I think. So maybe scale it down to 0.075, or maybe a little bit more than that, maybe 0.085. Maybe decrease the scale randomness to 0.6. So something like this. Feel free to play around with your various settings, but this should be pretty good. I might scale these down a bit. But this is the general idea. You just want to create the data for your heat distortion. And as you can see here, if I go to our rendered layer, this is all we're getting here, and we're just going to use this data for that displacement map. So now we're going to duplicate this particle system and place it in other areas where we want heat distortion to be in our scene. So I'll just select it here and I'll place it next to our fire in other areas of our shot. Rotate it around so you get a varied result. And I'll duplicate it once more, place it off to the left here, something like this. And yeah, this should be some pretty good data we can use as a heat distortion displacement map. So now what we're going to do is we're going to kind of clean up our view layers here so that we can composite them separately and effectively in our Blender compositor. So for our heat distortion view layer, as you can see in our camera view, when we zoom in, you can see that we're also rendering out some of our spark particles here, which we don't actually want for this view layer. So what I'm going to do is for our sparks collection, I'm going to enable our restriction toggles, and then I'm going to select indirect only for the sparks. So now the sparks are only going to indirectly affect our heat distortion displacement map. You can also turn off this layer entirely if you like, but this should work just fine. And this should be pretty good for our heat distortion view layer. One thing we do need to do for both of our view layers is make sure that our background is rendering as transparent. So I'm just going to go to our render tab here, and under film, I want to select the transparent checkbox. And now as you can see here, our render is transparent back here, which is exactly what we want. So now only distortion will be added to the white data of our footage, which is where our heat distortion particles are. Now that we've adjusted our heat distortion view layer, let's go to our sparks view layer. And we want to do a similar thing here. I'll select one of our spark emitters. We'll go to our rendered settings, and we don't want our heat distortion particles to show up here. So for our heat distortion collection, I will just completely disable this heat distortion collection from this view layer. And now we just have our spark emitters. And one thing I do want to do is bake these particle systems so that Blender doesn't have to go through their physics and particle settings every time we play through our timeline. So I'll go to our particle tab, and under cache, I will click on bake all dynamics, and now whenever we play through our scene, all that data is already collected for us. Alright, so this should be pretty good. Once more I'll check our rendered view. I'll go back to our particle settings just to check what we're looking at right now. I will deselect the show emitter option in our viewport display, and these are the sparks that we're getting, and this should be just fine. Alright, so now that we have created our two particle systems, let's do a test render and start compositing our two different view layers together. So I'll go to our render properties tab here and adjust a few of our settings. I'll change the render samples to maybe 32 just so we render a bit quicker. I'll select adaptive sampling as well, and for advanced I'll select the seed stopwatch for some noise variation. I'll keep motion blur selected because motion blur allows us to see the sparks kind of blur, which creates a nicer look for that particle. Rather than just a dot, it's kind of a slash of light. I might decrease the shutter to 0.35 though, just so it's not quite as long. And yeah, this should be pretty good. Now under output, make sure that you're rendering at 1920 by 1080p resolution if you want HD, and 100%. And for output, I recommend using OpenEXR for visual effects, and then choosing where you want to output your composite right here. And now that we've done this, I'll go ahead and click on File and Save, just to save our project. And we'll save it. And finally, we'll click on Render and Render Image, and let's see what we get for our test render. Alright guys, so we are back, and this is our render right out of Blender, and the sparks are already added on top of our footage. However, we need to composite everything together a little bit more specifically. So I'm going to go ahead and close our window here and go to our compositing tab. And these are the compositing nodes that Blender has automatically set up for us when we do our motion tracking and set up the tracking scene. But we're going to adjust them a bit here. I will go ahead and delete this bottom render layer here, and let's start adjusting some things. So the first thing we have, as you can see, is our live action shot here going into an undistortion and scale node. These are automatically added whenever we solve for the optics of the camera in our motion tracking process. And I'll move this alpha over node to our composite really quick, as well as our view node, and delete this alpha over. So right now we have our live action shot, and then our sparks view layer here is being overlaid on top of it with this alpha over node here, and then that's just going to our composite. And our sparks are looking pretty cool. It's already being integrated into our shot fairly effectively. You could, of course, add some different effects to it here. Maybe we could add some glare to it, blend it into the shot a bit better. I'll use the fog glow setting, and maybe bring down the threshold a bit to 0 so it just makes it a little bit brighter. Maybe press Shift A. I'll add a color RGB curves node, and as you can see, we're brightening up these sparks a bit. You can increase their brightness even more if you'd like with an RGB curve setting, something like that, for example. That's obviously too much, but you get the general idea. But now that we have our sparks view layer going into the right alpha over node, let's add our heat distortion on top of our footage here. So I'll just move our composite and view node off to the right here. I'll duplicate our alpha over node with Shift A, add this to here, and connect it to our composite. Now I want to press Shift A again. I'll add an input render layers. And for this render layer input, I will select the heat distortion view layer, and then I will press Shift A again. Under distort, I will add a displace node, and I will connect this to our node tree. And actually, we don't need this alpha over node here. I made a mistake there, so I'll delete that one. We just need our displacement node. So I will take our image data from our heat distortion layer and connect it to our vector, which will be the data for our displacement map. And then what we can do is we can increase the X scale and the Y scale for this displacement map to actually create that heat distortion. Instead of adjusting them one by one, however, what I want to do is just add a value node that increases them both at the same time. So I'll press Shift A, I will add an input value, and I will move this value to both the X scale and the Y scale value. And now, as you can see here, if we increase this, we get some heat distortion based on the heat displacement layer that we've added. And you can also see that there's a little bit of a hard curve here that's happening from our heat distortion layer, because those icospheres that we're using for the heat distortion are very clean in the shot. So what we can do to blend this into our shot a bit better so we don't have these hard edges is, for one, not have the value so high, which we don't want so high anyway. But the other thing we can do is just blur this heat distortion view layer before it gets to the displacement map. So we can press Shift A, I'll add a filter, blur, make it, I'll go ahead and make it bokeh blur just for the sake of this tutorial, and I'll increase the X and Y value to maybe try 10 pixels each to just take the edge off of this displacement map here, make it a little bit more natural. And now, as you can see here, it's a little bit more natural in our scene here. Obviously, it's still too much for the value of our displacement map, but this is the general idea. I might increase the X value to 20 of this blur, as well as the Y value. And then I'll decrease the value of our displacement map to maybe try something like 40 pixels should be pretty good once we render this all out. And there we have it. Now we have a much more natural looking displacement map. And as our heat distortion particles move, that's going to create that heat wave effect through this displace node here. But that is the general concept behind adding some heat distortion and sparks to enhance some fire in your scene. I hope this video was helpful. As always, feel free to leave a comment if you have any questions or suggestions in the comment section below. Let us know what you'd like to see next, and I'll see you next time.